She wasn't loud. She wasn't tall. She didn't carry a badge or wear a uniform. She walked into the restaurant like anyone else might. Alone, calm, quiet. But within 15 seconds, the entire room would know her name, and 3 arrogant men would regret ever laying eyes on her, because this wasn't just dinner. This was the moment when someone ordinary became extraordinary, not by shouting, but by standing, not with rage, but with resolve. This is the story of Serena Blake. And the night the world realized that strength doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it wears a simple gray jacket and sits quietly until the moment it doesn't. The aroma of caramelized lemongrass drifted gently through the air as soft jazz fluttered from vintage speakers mounted along the bamboo-paneled ceiling. Lotus and Lantern wasn't just any restaurant. It was a tucked-away Vietnamese-French fusion bistro nestled in Port Harbor's historic district, the kind of place where warm light bounced off textured walls and wine glasses sang when tapped softly for attention. It was a haven for date nights, reunions, and the occasional soul-craving solitude. It was a Friday evening, the kind of night when life moved just slow enough to feel special. A fine mist painted the cobblestones outside, and the harbor lights beyond the window danced like lanterns bobbing on velvet water. The bell above the door chimed as a woman stepped in quietly. Alone, unnoticed at first, she didn't seek attention, and she certainly didn't demand it. She walked with calm purpose, her steps soft but sure, her frame neither tall nor imposing, just a woman in a slate-gray dress, a wool shawl draped over her shoulder, eyes observant but unassuming. Her name was Serena Blake, 33, recently returned from active deployment, but to anyone watching, she was just another face in the crowd, someone perhaps waiting for a friend or a quiet night of reflection. No one could have guessed that behind her composed exterior rested a tactical edge sharpened by over a decade. With the Coast Guard Tactical Response Unit, Serena had spent the last 17 months embedded in high-risk maritime rescue operations near the Gulf, facing pirates, hurricanes, and moments where seconds decided if someone lived or drowned. But here in Port Harbor, she wasn't a hero or a protector. She was just Serena, trying to remember what stillness felt like. She asked the hostess for a table by the window, away from the bar, near the glass panes that looked out across the sleepy bay, a spot she always used to choose before missions, before the nights filled with radio static and steel rain. The hostess smiled, nodded, and guided her through a corridor of softly murmuring tables and flickering candles. No one paid much attention, just another guest seeking comfort in cuisine. Serena settled into her seat with a quiet exhale, removed her shawl, folded it precisely, and placed it on her lap. Her fingers grazed the menu, but she didn't need to read it. She already knew what she'd order. Grilled duck spring rolls followed by the house's signature lemongrass pho, a bowl she had dreamed about during long nights in sea-bound silence. Around her, the room was gentle and alive. Couples leaned in to whisper over shared appetizers. A group of friends clinked glasses and laughed. The staff moved like a quiet orchestra, carrying plates with grace. But as Serena's gaze wandered, it stopped at the bar. 3 men had just walked in, their voices immediately louder than the music, their laughter sharp like cracked ice against a warm surface. They wore semi-casual blazers and linen shirts, the kind that screamed weekend startup energy, overconfident, polished, maybe successful, their hair slicked, watches gleaming, teeth too white to be humble. At first, they simply laughed and drank, their voices dominating the room. But Serena's attention wasn't caught by the volume. It was the rhythm, the way their eyes scanned the space not out of curiosity but ownership, like they had walked into a party they believed existed for them alone. She watched them for another minute, then turned back to her table, sipping water, trying to let the noise drift away like the tide. She wasn't on duty, she reminded herself. This wasn't a scene needing intervention, not yet. But tension, real tension, isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins with a single gesture that doesn't fit, a glance that lingers a second too long, a joke told without care for who hears it. Serena had learned to read those signs the hard way, not in classrooms but in close quarters, on oil tankers, in rescue cutters, in places where people showed their true selves under pressure. The men at the bar ordered another round. Their laughter grew cruder, not just jokes now, but comments directed at the waitresses, at women walking past their stools, at one woman who had dared to sit alone at the bar. Their words dipped in mock charm, but thick with disrespect. A waitress flinched as one of them touched her shoulder under the guise of asking for another bottle. Serena's brow twitched, her fingers still wrapped around her water glass. She didn't move, but her breathing changed ever so slightly. Slow, deep, controlled. Still she said nothing. Still she waited. Because people like Serena don't react on impulse. They assess, they observe, and then they decide when it's time. And in the next 15 minutes, Serena Blake would decide. A choice that would change the mood of the room. The perception of every single person present, and the lives of 3 men who had no idea they'd just laughed their way into the wrong fight. Because one of the diners wasn't just a woman with a quiet gaze. She was a storm that hadn't yet been summoned, but she would be soon, very soon. The soup arrived with a gentle clink, steam swirling upward, carrying the scent of star anise, cinnamon, and roasted marrow bones. Serena's eyes softened as she leaned slightly forward, the rising aroma like a memory, warm and sharp all at once. Her hands moved with practiced grace as she adjusted the spoon and chopsticks, the way someone trained to make every motion count would do. From her seat by the window, she could see both the entrance and the bar. She hadn't requested that angle by chance. Habits like that stayed with you, especially after years spent in confined spaces where knowing your exit could mean the difference between life and death. Serena didn't feel paranoid. She felt aware, the kind of awareness born from surviving places most people never even imagined. She took her first sip, letting the broth linger on her tongue. And for a brief moment, the outside world melted. The chatter dimmed. The laughter from the bar became distant like a radio playing in another room. But serenity, as always, was fleeting. From the bar, the voices returned, louder now, slurred around the edges. Those 3 men still seated, still ordering, still laughing, had begun to draw attention, though not the kind they believed. Other patrons exchanged subtle glances. Servers passed with tighter smiles and quicker steps, and the mood, once cozy and golden, now rippled with an undercurrent of unease. Serena didn't need to hear every word to know what was being said. The tone alone was enough. One man leaned too close to a waitress as she poured wine, whispering something that made her cheeks flush not with pleasure but with discomfort. Another pointed across the room at 2 women sharing appetizers, nudging his friend with a smirk, as if possession were a joke worth sharing. She watched as one of them gestured dramatically toward the kitchen, his hand slicing through the air, nearly striking a passing busser. The young man stumbled but said nothing, only dipped his head and kept moving. Serena's spoon paused mid-air. She could feel it, that subtle shift. Like the air before a storm, something was turning. And so she scanned the room again, not in panic but in calculation. To her right, a family of 4, parents in their late 40s, 2 teenage kids hunched over their phones, pretending not to notice. Behind her, a couple in their early 20s, the man timid, the woman visibly tense, shrinking slightly every time the bar's laughter pierced the air. Serena took another slow sip. In the Coast Guard, She'd once boarded a freighter where hostages were being held below deck. It had been quiet. Too quiet, just like this. Until everything erupted at once. She'd learned then that danger rarely came roaring in like thunder. More often it crept in with laughter, charm, and entitlement. It wore a smile until the moment it showed its teeth. She saw that now. In the bar's reflection across the glass, she watched as one of the men pointed directly toward the young woman seated behind her, mouthing something crude, then raised his drink and toasted the joke. Only he understood. The woman stiffened. The man with her shifted uncomfortably, pretending to adjust his napkin. But Serena could tell he felt powerless. His posture said it all. Shoulders inward, jaw tight. A glance toward the door, then quickly back to his plate. Serena had seen that look too. Not just in civilians, but in rookies during their first mission. That quiet panic when instinct screams to flee, but duty or shame keeps you rooted in place. She set her spoon down. She didn't need to know the couple's names or their story. She only needed to know they were being hunted in plain sight, not by predators with weapons, but by men who believed their charm, wealth, and confidence made them untouchable. She reached for her glass of water, took a long sip, eyes never leaving the mirror-like reflection in the window. One of the men rose from the bar, the tallest of the three, square-jawed, broad shoulders, his shirt unbuttoned one too many times, revealing a gold chain that caught the overhead lights. He adjusted his cuffs and sauntered forward as if the entire restaurant were his playground. He didn't head for the restroom. He headed toward the couple, and with every step, Serena felt the room hold its breath. It was subtle but undeniable. Forks paused mid-bite. Conversation dropped into whispers. Even the music seemed to dim as he passed. He was only halfway to the couple when he suddenly turned, locked eyes with Serena in the window's reflection, and gave a smug little smirk. Not a greeting, a challenge. She blinked slowly, didn't react, but inside, something shifted. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the winds were changing. And Serena Blake, sitting alone with a bowl of pho and a clear view of every corner in that bistro, knew exactly how to read the weather. The man didn't go back to his seat. Instead, he lingered near the couple's table, arms casually folded as if waiting for something to entertain him. His gaze locked onto the young woman across from the timid boyfriend. And with every passing second, his smirk deepened. A performance just beginning. He leaned in slightly, said something inaudible, and even though Serena couldn't hear the words, she saw the way the woman stiffened, how her boyfriend's hand reached out, not to stop him, but to steady her. His mouth moved, polite, awkward, probably something like, "Please leave us alone." But the man only chuckled and leaned in farther, close enough that Serena could now hear the tail end of his sentence, just saying you've got a look that deserves better company. The words were casual, but carried that oily confidence of someone who never heard the word no. The young woman looked down at her plate, clearly hoping he'd get bored and walk away. But Serena knew better. Men like him didn't retreat unless made to, and the other two at the bar watched with amusement, raising their glasses in silent cheers. The waitress walked past Serena's table, her hands shaking slightly, the tray balanced against her palm, as if she'd rather be anywhere else. Serena leaned back just enough to catch her attention. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly, eyes kind but serious. The waitress blinked, nodded too quickly, forced a smile, her voice tight. "Just a busy night," she said, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Busy wasn't the word. The entire restaurant was holding its breath. Serena glanced around, subtle but deliberate. Every table now seemed to be watching without watching, head slightly turned, eyes flickering over wine glasses or behind phone screens. A few diners looked away when Serena's gaze passed over them, embarrassed, perhaps, not by the scene unfolding, but by their own silence. And then it happened. The man reached down. His fingers brushed the young woman's shoulder, not a friendly tap, but a slow press that lingered just long enough to turn discomfort into dread. The boyfriend stood up, his voice soft but firm. "Please, we're just trying to enjoy our evening." It was a good try, Serena thought, calm but direct, the kind of response that should have been enough. But the man just laughed. "Oh, I see, the little guy's got a spine," he said, loud enough for others to hear, and behind him, his two friends roared with delight, the sound sharp and hollow. The young woman winced. The boyfriend faltered. The man took a step closer, and that's when Serena stood up. She didn't move fast, didn't draw attention. She simply rose from her chair and laid her napkin on the table, her hands relaxed by her sides, her expression unreadable. But even that small motion sent a ripple through the room. Someone whispered something 2 tables over. A glass clinked against a plate. A fork slipped from a hand. And still the man kept talking. "I'm just having a friendly chat," he said, now directing his voice towards Serena without turning around. "Nothing wrong with complimenting a beautiful lady." The boyfriend stepped in again, voice tighter this time. "She's not interested. Please, step away." There it was. The second boundary crossed. Serena's boots barely made a sound as she walked forward, the hem of her dress grazing her knees, her posture straight but not stiff, fluid but intentional, like someone who had long ago memorized the exact space between control and confrontation. She stopped about 5 feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough to give him a choice. "Sir," she said, her voice calm, low, every syllable clear. "They've asked you to stop. You should listen." He turned now, fully, took her in, tilted his head and chuckled. "Well, look at that. The quiet one's got something to say," he muttered. Then took a deliberate step toward her, towering over her now. "You here alone, sweetheart?" he asked. "Or are you just bored with your soup?" Behind him, his friends hooted again. Drunk on their own egos, Serena didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply replied, "I'm not here to entertain you." Something in her tone made his smile falter, not entirely, but enough for a flicker of unease to pass through his eyes. And then, silence. That thick, suspended kind of silence that comes before a storm. Every breath in the room seemed held, every heartbeat louder than the music. The man stepped closer. "You really think you can stop me?" he asked, and his voice dropped an octave, stripped of charm now, left only with heat and insult. Serena took one breath, just one slow and centered. And somewhere deep inside her mind, she let go of dinner. Let go of calm and prepared for the next moment, because she had seen this dance before. In refugee boats drifting toward nowhere, in cargo ships seized by pirates, in alleyways outside ports where authority was only as strong as the person willing to enforce it, Serena Blake was no stranger to escalation. But what these men didn't know was that the very act of stepping into her space meant she no longer had to ask. It meant she could act. And in the seconds that followed, everything would change. The tall man's eyes narrowed, not in fear, not yet, but in that familiar shade of arrogance that comes from never being challenged. He took one more step toward Serena. A mere 2 feet now separated them. And in his eyes danced the belief that nothing about this moment was serious, that nothing about this woman standing between him and his game could possibly threaten him. "You got fire," he muttered with a crooked grin. "But you really should mind your own table." Serena didn't respond, not with words, not yet. Instead, she let the silence speak, let it stretch between them like a wire pulled tight. Behind her, the young couple sat, frozen, the woman still clutching her glass of water as if it might protect her. The boyfriend leaned forward slightly, ready to intervene again. Even though the last time he'd tried, it had only earned them more laughter, more mockery. At the bar, the other two men stood now, emboldened by their friend's performance. One rolled up his sleeves, the other raised his phone slightly, like he meant to record, or maybe just intimidate. One of them called out, "Come on, bro, she's not worth it." But the tall man waved him off, his gaze fixed on Serena's face. Then, with one deliberate motion, he raised his hand and pressed a single finger against Serena's collarbone, just enough pressure to mock, just enough to cross the final line. That was the moment the air changed, the moment the room snapped from waiting to watching, the second that touch made contact. Serena's eyes sharpened, and everything she had suppressed, every trained instinct that she had held beneath the surface, was now fully authorized to rise in her world. There were no half measures. There was only before the boundary, and after. And now, she was after. Her hand moved faster than the eye could follow. She caught his wrist in one fluid motion, not hard, not violent, but with absolute control, twisting it down and away from her body. His expression shifted in a heartbeat. From amusement to confusion, and then to pain as his shoulder dropped under the pressure. "What the hell?" he hissed, trying to yank free. But Serena stepped in, pivoted her hip slightly, and leveraged his momentum, using nothing but his own size against him. His knees buckled, and the next sound in the restaurant was not a word, not a shout, but the heavy, breathless thud of his body hitting the floor. Face down, flat, silenced gasps swept the room. Forks clattered. A wine glass tipped and rolled off a table. The young woman at the table covered her mouth. Her boyfriend's eyes widened in stunned disbelief. The other two men froze, caught between disbelief and prideful anger. The shorter one moved first, charging forward with a barked curse, arms raised like he meant to shove her aside. But Serena was already turning, already assessing his angle, already lowering her stance. He reached for her shoulder. She let him, then shifted, dropped low, and swept his leg clean out from under him. He hit the ground sideways, ribs first, the wind whooshing from his lungs like air from a popped balloon. The third man, the stocky one with the phone, suddenly looked less sure of himself. His bravado faltered as he glanced at his friends, now groaning on the floor, one cradling his wrist, the other trying to sit up and failing. He turned, tried to run, but Serena didn't chase. She simply stepped into his path and said one word, "Stop." He didn't, so she sidestepped again, redirected his momentum with a light push to his elbow, and sent him sprawling into the host stand, menus scattering like leaves in the wind. 3 men. 3 bodies on the floor. The whole thing took less than 15 seconds, and yet, for everyone in that restaurant, it would play on repeat in their minds for years. Serena stood in the center of the room now, her chest rising and falling with quiet control, her stance calm, measured, no sign of panic, only discipline. Her eyes scanned the room, not to boast, not to judge, but to check, to ensure the threat was neutralized. The young woman was safe. The boyfriend had wrapped his arms around her, both of them trembling but unharmed. The waitress, now peeking from the kitchen entrance, stared with her mouth open, one hand still gripping a tray. At the bar, other diners had backed away, unsure whether to clap or remain frozen, their phones now recording what they had not dared to interfere in. It wasn't just a takedown. It wasn't just self-defense. It was something else, something far rarer, a moment where someone chose to intervene and did so with clarity, with precision, with power, the kind of power that doesn't scream. It simply acts. And when it does, it changes everything. The three men, sprawled in pain and humiliation, still didn't seem to grasp what had just happened. But the room did. The silence that followed was not awkward or fearful. It was reverent, as if they had just witnessed something sacred. Serena straightened her posture, adjusted her shawl as if nothing had happened, and walked back toward her table, her steps steady, unshaken. Behind her whispers grew, the first spark of a story igniting. And what had once been just another quiet evening at Lotus and Lantern had now become the beginning of something unforgettable. The room remained silent long after the sound of bodies hitting the floor had faded. It wasn't just the shock of violence. It was the quiet aftershock of witnessing something no one quite knew how to process. The kind of silence that comes when you've just seen a bolt of lightning crack open a sky you thought was clear. Serena stood still, her breathing steady, her gaze sweeping once more across the room, not to invite attention, but to ensure every threat had been contained. She didn't move like someone who had just fought. She moved like someone who had simply responded. It was then the whispers began. First, a single voice near the kitchen, hushed but sharp. "Did you see that?" Then another near the bar, spoken under breath. "She dropped him like nothing. I didn't even see her move." Across the room, chairs shifted, glasses clinked nervously as hands shook, and someone fumbled with a phone, still recording, the red dot blinking softly like a witness that never blinks. The manager of the Lotus and Lantern emerged slowly from the back, his white shirt stained from a dropped tray he'd dropped when the chaos broke out. His eyes darted between the fallen men and Serena. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but found no words that felt appropriate. Instead, he stepped forward and asked the only thing he could manage. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Serena nodded once, calm and direct. "Yes," she said simply, then turned her eyes to the couple at the table. The young woman sat trembling, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide, not with fear but with disbelief. Her boyfriend held her tightly, one hand stroking her back, the other gripping the edge of the table like it might keep the world from tipping over. Serena approached slowly, her movements still gentle, composed, as if to not further disturb the moment. "You're safe now," she said, and her voice, though soft, carried a power that made the couple both nod at once. Like children reassured by a parent, the young man looked up at her, eyes filled with confusion and awe. What did you just do?" he asked. Serena tilted her head slightly, offering no pride, no explanation. Just this, "I stopped them." It wasn't bravado, it was fact. And that simplicity carried more weight than any performance could have. Behind her, one of the men groaned on the floor, clutching his side. The other still lay flat, winded, while the third, the first to fall, had managed to roll onto his back, his expression vacant, somewhere between pain and disbelief. No one moved to help them, not yet. And maybe not at all. From one of the booths near the window, an elderly man stood up slowly, his cane tapping the floor with a sharp click. "I saw everything," he said, his voice raspy but loud enough to be heard. "They had it coming." That statement, simple as it was, broke the tension in the room. More voices rose. "I recorded it," someone said. "She saved that girl," added another. The murmur of voices grew louder, not chaotic but unified, like the crowd had finally decided whose side to stand on. The tall man on the floor lifted a shaking arm and pointed at Serena. "She's crazy," he croaked. "We were just talking. She attacked us." The accusation landed flat. The crowd didn't waver. The truth was too clear, too sharp, too freshly burned into their memory. Another man near the bar stood up. "That's a lie," he said firmly. "You harassed that girl, wouldn't back off, then touched this woman first. We all saw it." A woman at the corner table raised her phone. "I've got the whole thing on video." And just like that, the power shifted entirely. No longer were the three men threats. They were the ones surrounded now by witnesses, by truth, by a room that had found its voice. Serena stepped back toward her table, quietly retrieving her shawl from the chair, folding it with the same deliberate grace she had shown before the storm. The waitress emerged again from the kitchen, her hands still trembling slightly, but this time her eyes locked on Serena's. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Serena nodded again. The moment had passed. The storm was over, but its impact had only begun. Phones were out now, recording, replaying, uploading, sharing. Already the title would write itself. Woman in Bistro takes down 3 men in 15 seconds. The kind of story that doesn't need embellishment to go viral. The kind of truth that travels faster than fiction ever could. Serena didn't seek the spotlight. She never had. But some people don't need a stage to be seen. They just need a moment. And in that small restaurant, lit by paper lanterns and quiet gasps, that moment had arrived. By the time the sirens began to wail in the distance, their sound bouncing off the brick-lined alleyways of Port Harbor's old district, the mood inside Lotus and Lantern had shifted entirely. What had begun as an ordinary evening, a soft-lit dinner, a few glasses of wine, background jazz humming under conversations, had now transformed into something far less forgettable, something larger than any one person could contain. Serena Blake stood quietly beside the host stand, her shawl folded neatly over her arm, her posture unchanged, the very picture of composure. But around her, the energy pulsed like a live wire. Cameras were everywhere now. Not just from the staff's security feeds, but from nearly every diner with a phone in hand. The videos showed everything. From the first disrespectful gesture to the instant Serena dropped 3 grown men to the floor in less time than it takes to describe it. No one told her to stay, but no one wanted her to leave either. The young couple stood nearby, the woman now leaning on her boyfriend's shoulder, eyes red but no longer trembling. The man kept looking at Serena as if she might vanish if he blinked too long. The staff kept glancing between her and the front door, as though trying to determine whether they should treat her like a guest or something closer to legend. When the officers arrived, the moment hit a new pitch. 3 officers stepped into the restaurant, boots wet from the rain, their eyes scanning the room with practiced urgency. But it took them less than a second to understand that this was no ordinary fight call. The 3 men on the floor were conscious now, but only barely, bruised and disoriented, one clutching his wrist, another rubbing his ribs, the third still sprawled where Serena had left him. The officers made their way towards the scene, but before they could ask a single question, voices rose from all corners of the room. "She saved her," said a diner near the window. "They were harassing everyone," said another, holding up a phone. "She warned them. They didn't listen. She barely touched them, just used their own weight. They touched her first," someone else added. The flood of testimonies came not in chaos, but in rhythm, like a chorus swelling behind one clear truth. Serena stood among them without saying a word, and yet her silence carried the most weight. One of the officers, a woman with short blonde hair and stripes on her shoulder, approached Serena directly. "Ma'am," she said, her tone professional but measured, "can you tell me what happened?" Serena nodded once. "They were harassing a couple and a waitress," she said. "I asked them to stop. One of them put his hands on me. I responded with appropriate force to neutralize the threat." That was all she said. No embellishment, no emotion, just facts. And that was what made the officers pause, then glance at one another, then at the crowd again, realizing they weren't facing a suspect. They were standing in front of the reason this hadn't turned into something far worse. Outside, red and blue lights swirled across the wet street, drawing more eyes, more phones, more questions. The manager of the restaurant stepped forward, nervous at first, then steadier. "We have security footage, the whole thing, and we'll turn it over," he said. "And I'll make a statement. This woman protected our guests." By the end of the hour, the 3 men were in custody, their protests growing more desperate as the truth closed in. "This is insane, she attacked us," one of them shouted, still clinging to denial. But the crowd no longer listened. They had seen, and seeing changes everything. That night, the first video went live, posted on a community Facebook group with the caption, "This woman just protected an entire restaurant in Port Harbor tonight. Watch her take down 3 guys in 15 seconds. No fear, no hesitation. Who is she?" The post gained 100 shares in the first hour, then 1,000 by morning. By noon the next day, local news picked it up. Dinner interrupted. Woman defends couple from harassment, silences aggressors. Then national outlets came calling. Unknown heroine turns the tables in viral video. Who is the woman in gray? Speculation flooded the internet. Some said she had to be military. Others guessed martial arts champion. A few wild theories claimed she was part of a covert security detail for someone famous dining nearby. But no one really knew, and Serena didn't answer. Not right away. She returned home that night to her small apartment on the outskirts of town, turned off her phone, and stared out her window at the dark ocean beyond, waves lapping gently against the shore, the only sound reminding her that the world was still quiet somewhere. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She had simply seen someone in danger and done what she was trained to do. But the world, hungry for truth, for justice, for something real, had seen more than action. They had seen character, and in a society often numbed by headlines and noise that meant everything. The next morning, Port Harbor woke to something it hadn't expected. It wasn't the usual fog curling over the docks, or the sound of seagulls calling out across the bay. It wasn't the clatter of cafe cups, or the familiar rhythm of boats bobbing in the harbor. It was the name Serena Blake, and no one could agree on exactly who she was. The video had crossed 100,000 views before sunrise, then 500,000 before breakfast. By midday, the news anchors no longer asked if she had military training. They debated which branch and what rank. Martial arts experts slowed the footage frame by frame on daytime television, narrating each move like a sports commentator analyzing a championship match. "That's a redirection move taught in high-level defensive training," one former Navy instructor said on Channel 9, pointing at the precise moment Serena had flipped the second man to the ground. Another, on a podcast, whispered, "She didn't fight with strength. She fought with structure, with precision. That's not just instinct. That's years of service." But even as the media filled in the blanks, Serena remained silent. No social posts, no statements, no live streams, just absence. And that absence only made the story grow. Comment threads filled with theories. "She's ex-military, has to be. CIA, maybe. My cousin's in Coast Guard tactical response, says they train like that. I hope she runs for office, we need people like her. She's a queen, protect her at all costs." Every hour, someone new discovered the video, reshared it, added a caption, a reaction, a tearful comment. And the people in that restaurant, those who'd seen it with their own eyes, became reluctant celebrities themselves. The young couple was invited onto local morning shows. They didn't smile for attention. They looked humbled, changed, still a little shaken. The boyfriend spoke quietly. "I was scared," he admitted. "I couldn't stop them. I didn't know how to protect her, but then this woman, Serena, she didn't hesitate. She just stood up, and everything changed." The girl beside him, now more composed, held his hand tightly as she added, "I'll never forget her face, not just the way she moved, but the way she looked at us after, like we mattered." In every interview, in every clip, Serena became more than a name. She became an idea, not a superhero, not a warrior, something more grounded, more real. Someone who didn't wear a cape, but walked straight into discomfort, into danger, because it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, in Port Harbor's municipal building, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. A quiet knock on the office door of Commander Roland DeWitt was followed by the entrance of a young officer, clearly nervous. "Sir," she said, holding a folder tightly, "we've confirmed. The woman in the video. It's Serena Blake." DeWitt took the file with a slow exhale, opened it, scanned the documents, then leaned back in his chair. Of course it was. Serena had always had a reputation, not for flash or rank climbing, but for something far more difficult to earn respect without words. She had never sought attention, never asked for recognition. And yet, she was the one they sent when a mission required clarity under pressure, when lives depended not just on action, but on judgment. He flipped the folder closed and nodded. "Let's prepare an internal statement," he said. But no public comment, not yet. Outside the building, journalists waited, knocking on doors, showing screenshots, asking if anyone knew the quiet woman who had walked out of Lotus and Lantern and into the heart of the internet. And slowly, reluctantly, the pieces began to surface. A neighbor remembered Serena jogging every morning at 5, rain or shine. A retired librarian said she had once donated dozens of children's books in honor of her late father. A former classmate from high school described her as the girl who never talked much, but always helped everyone. The story deepened. Not only was she skilled, she was kind. Not only was she disciplined, she was thoughtful. And the contrast between her and the men she had taken down became more stark with every new post, every article, every segment. Those men, now facing formal charges, tried to pivot, to paint themselves as misunderstood. But it was too late. The internet had seen. The world had seen. And no amount of spin could rewrite what had been so clearly captured in those 15 unforgettable seconds. The public began to push. They wanted to know more, not for gossip, but for guidance. What kind of training made someone so calm under fire? What kind of heart made someone stand up when no one else did? And most of all, how could they be more like her? The hashtag number sign. Be Like Serena appeared first on Twitter, then on Instagram, then carved into chalk on sidewalk corners near high schools, spray-painted onto murals in skate parks, handwritten on Post-it notes stuck to coffee shop counters. Serena Blake, whether she liked it or not, had become a name that meant more than a moment. She had become a symbol, and the world was not finished listening. By the end of the week, the video had been viewed over 27 million times, and still Serena Blake had not spoken publicly, not in interviews, not in statements, not even on social media. Yet her silence did not dampen the conversation. It amplified it. Because when the world is used to noise, silence becomes power. In schools across the country, teachers played the clip to start discussions about courage, ethics, and bystander responsibility. Classrooms once divided by cliques and phone screens now united around one question. What would you do if you were there? In community centers, the hashtag number sign. Be Like Serena had become a movement. Self-defense instructors saw a spike in enrollment. Parents signed up their daughters for martial arts classes not to fight, but to walk with strength. In churches, cafes, and subway platforms, people recognized one another in hushed tones. That's the woman. From the video. Have you seen it? Can you believe how calm she was? And still, Serena stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but out of discipline, because she understood something the world often forgets. Moments like that are not about the spotlight. They are about the reason you act when no one else will, but when the mayor of Port Harbor invited her to a community gathering honoring her courage and promised it would be small, respectful, no press allowed, Serena finally agreed. She arrived in a gray jacket and dark jeans, her hair tied back, her eyes alert but soft. She did not walk like a hero. She walked like someone used to long hallways and quiet decisions. The room stood when she entered. Not because she asked them to, but because reverence rises for those who never demand it. The young couple was there, holding hands, the woman now smiling freely, her voice no longer trembling. The waitress from the bistro stood nearby, her apron traded for a floral dress. She had brought flowers, a simple bouquet of wild blooms wrapped in brown paper. And near the podium stood the mayor, hands folded respectfully, waiting. When Serena stepped up to speak, no one reached for their phones, no one interrupted. The air was still. She looked across the room, took one breath, then began. "I didn't expect this," she said, her voice firm but kind. "I didn't want this." Some heads nodded, understanding. "I didn't act because I'm brave," she continued. "I acted because someone needed help and no one else was moving." A pause. She let the weight of the words settle. "I've spent a lot of years learning how to respond in moments of danger, how to stay clear when things go dark. But that night, at that restaurant, I wasn't there to fight. I was there to eat dinner." Laughter rippled gently. "But sometimes the world doesn't care about your plans," she said. "Sometimes the right thing walks into your path, and the question becomes not whether you are ready, but whether you are willing." Silence returned. And then she gave them what they didn't expect. Not strategy, not technique, but this. "You don't need to know judo to stand up for someone," she said. "You don't need military training to say stop. Sometimes all you need is to be the one who says enough when no one else does." A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. A man near the back whispered to his son, "Listen to her." Serena glanced at the young couple, smiled gently, then said, "And if you can't fight like I did, fight in your way, with your voice, your presence, your courage, because courage is not the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when fear is sitting beside you." When she stepped down from the podium, the room didn't erupt into applause. It rose in quiet, lasting respect. Afterward, she walked to the couple, shook their hands, hugged the waitress, accepted the bouquet with a slight nod and left as simply as she had arrived. But something had changed. Not just for her. For everyone. Because in a world where headlines fade fast and outrage burns hot then cold, this story had stayed. Not because it was violent, but because it was clear. Because it reminded people that strength isn't just physical. It's moral. It's human. It's ordinary people stepping into extraordinary moments and refusing to look away. Weeks later, a small plaque appeared at the entrance of Lotus and Lantern, mounted near the host stand in quiet brass. It didn't list the names of the men or the date of the event. It simply read, "Here, one woman stood up when others stayed silent. May we all have her courage. Thank you, Serena Blake." And every day, strangers paused in front of it, some in silence, some in tears, some just taking a photo to remember, because stories fade, but legacy whispers for a long time, and Serena Blake, without ever asking for it, had become one. So now you've seen what happened when one woman chose not to look away, when she didn't wait for someone else to act, when she decided that fear would not be louder than what was right. But ask yourself, if you were in that room, would you have stood up? Would you have spoken? Would you have dared to be the one who says enough? Because Serena Blake didn't just protect two people that night. She reminded an entire world that courage is contagious, that one act of strength can echo louder than a million words, and in a world that often feels colder, darker, more indifferent each day. Her silence became the roar of justice, and maybe that's why we're still talking about it, not just because it was shocking, but because deep down, we all want to believe that when the moment comes, we too will choose courage over comfort. And if this story moved you, even just a little, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let it be a reminder, a spark, a warning, or a wake-up call. Because one day, someone else might need you to be Serena.